one, I think. When you were at a buffet, and some of us might say, well, I haven't been out to a buffet in a long time, but think of like a wedding or some sort of a social thing that you went to, sometimes funerals. There's a lot of times that we go to buffets that we don't even mean to be at buffets. What are you most likely to look for first? Are you a loaded up the first time or a few smaller samples type person?
You got to look at dessert first to see how much dinner you can have.
Okay.
Exactly. You're my kind of man. And maybe pass by the salad on the way to dessert and get that dessert on your tray.
I always told my brother-in-law, Todd, he came to our church while we were there, and we'd have these potlucks, and I'd always go to the first table. I said, Todd, no room for salad. You guys, if you start loading up on the salad first, you're not going to have room for the other stuff. You got to. I learned that early on as a student. There was a minister that I worked with. He came with like a cafeteria tray with sections to any potluck. He never trusted them to have a good plate. The man was rail thin. He was like 6'2" and probably 130 pounds. But he always skipped the salad table, went right to the good stuff. He had his cafeteria tray ready to go. Go to the dessert first.
Well, the rest of us couldn't do that.
I've always enjoyed going to see whenever there's any kind of seafood at the salad bar. Anytime they reload those trays, you see people, all of a sudden there's a mad dash for whatever that is, I feel like.
Also in my church that I go to in Cold Snack after church, which I haven't been to there in a year, but we always had a wonderful assortment of cookies and cakes and things to the extent of lunch after services. And it got to be almost a competition among people until they, announced slow it down. Well, then we moved outside, and now they're having, starting this week, prepackaged a little cookie or something and some kind of a beverage in a pre-poured serving cup. So nobody touches anybody else's or gets anybody else's contamination, but they're going to try starting some food again.
We started that just this past week for our confirmation celebration, and we had cupcakes and served cookies and drinks. I think it went pretty well, but yeah. So the desserts seem to be a good
idea,
a good answer here as far as when you have the chance. What do you go for? It seems like kind of a funny question to ask, but we're gonna talk a little bit about a story where some people had the opportunity to go a little wild and may have overdone it, which we're going to be talking about war prisoners, but it's not an easy connection to make, but most of us don't have that experience, but we all do have the experience of seeing a lot before us sometimes and deciding whether we take it easy or go over the top. So with that, we're going to enter into our passage today, and we're going to turn to 2 Chronicles, right in the heart of the Old Testament here. These are the history books of the Old Testament. 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles. And the chronicler is not the same person, we do not think, who's recording the history of the kings, because there are some slight differences in the account. So we're not quite sure what the chronicler's motivations are. But as we get to chapter 28, we find a unique passage. So chapter 27 was about the reign of the king Jotham in the southern kingdom of Judah. And that passage is 9 verses long, and it's not all that interesting. It's pretty factual. This happened, he reigned this many years, he died, he was buried. Then we get to chapter 28, which adds about 20 verses to the story as we get to King Ahaz. So King Ahaz, there's a lot to talk about here.
And Chris,
Yes.
this is all post King David, post King Solomon, right?
So it's helpful to remember this is the Davidic line, and you don't get to be in the Davidic line until after David, the line of David. So when we start with Saul, we start with a king who is appointed by God, by the prophets. And then we get to David, who is not a relative of Saul's. But then after David, the kings after David are generally in his lineage, his genealogical lineage. And we see the northern and southern kingdoms split after David begets Solomon. And once Solomon starts begatting people, we see his sons split, the kingdom split under his sons and afterwards. But both the kings of the north and the kings of the south, Israel and Judah, continue to be related to David for the most part. They're in the Davidic line. So yes, this is after David. This is a number of generations after David, probably about not too many hundreds of years, but yeah, we're dealing with some kings down the line for a little while. So does anybody know anything about King Ahaz? King Ahaz shows up in a number of the books of the Bible.
Well, I can't think of any Christmas carol about him.
Ho, ho, ho. Yeah. He's just not memorable. He's one that you don't want to spend a lot of time reading about.
He's very memorable, but you might not want to spend much time reading about him. So one statement I agree 100% with, one statement I disagree with very, very strongly. So does anybody pick up on my hint? We think of him often at Christmas. Probably actually
you hang on the tree.
we think of him more accurately during Advent.
This is a
And for those who say he's not in any Christmas carols, it's not a Christmas carol per se, but Handel's Messiah is pretty well known. And there's a part there that has a whole lot of royal titles.
I've sung that numerous times, and
So you know about Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God,
yes,
Prince of Peace.
I never think of him.
Pastor Marcy, Isaiah, thank you, Pastor Marcy. The reason that Isaiah is saying that we're going to have a new king, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Isaiah is saying it to Ahaz. He's saying, you're bad, but we're going to have a new one. Ahaz is the reigning king when Isaiah starts talking about, look, a virgin shall conceive and bear a child. Ahaz is the king of Judah during a time when there was a world power, Assyria, that was starting to build. And basically what happens is there's kind of like a NATO alliance that's trying to keep Assyria in check. And it's Aram, which we call modern day Syria, and the northern kingdom of Jerusalem. They start getting together to say, we got to band together against these people who are in modern day Iraq. Assyria is going to take us all if we don't start banding together. And then Syria and Jerusalem say to Judah, join us in our coalition against Assyria. And Judah says, no, we don't want to do that. God tells Judah, don't do that. Judah's the kingdom to the south. Don't do that. And they don't for a long time until we get to Ahaz. And then Ahaz decides to not follow any of the prophets that come to him, chiefly among them Isaiah. Any of the Advent passages of Isaiah's prophecy, they happen in the court of Ahaz, because Ahaz, things go really bad under Ahaz. He's just not a good, faithful king at all. So we're going to read 2 Chronicles 28, verses 1 through 5a. So a lot of Bibles have verse 5 split in the middle. If yours doesn't, if you don't have a new paragraph in the middle of 5, I'll tell you where to stop. But would somebody be willing to read verses 1 through 5a?
Yeah, sure.
Rick, I'll call on you first.
Ahaz was 20 years old when he became king, and he reigned in Jerusalem 16 years. Unlike David, his father, he did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and also made cast idols for worshiping the Baals. He burned sacrifices in the valley of Ben Hinnom and sacrificed his sons in the fire, following the detestable ways of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. He offered sacrifices and burned incense at the high places, on the hilltops and under every spreading tree. Therefore the Lord, his God, handed him over to the king of Aram. The Arameans defeated him and took many of his people as prisoners and brought them to Damascus.
Thank you, Rick. So describe the first reaction to Ahaz here from the chronicler. Was he a good or bad king, and why? And what happens during his reign thus far?
Well, he sacrificed his sons. I didn't like that part.
He sacrificed his sons. You caught that, Carol. Yeah. That's bad. Yep.
He did not do what was right in the eyes of the Lord.
Didn't do what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as opposed to who?
His father David.
And just so we're all clear, this isn't actually David's son. This is like father as in like, you know, his ancestor. Like our founding fathers. When we use that terminology, we're not actually talking about fathers. We're talking about ancestors or, you know, those who came before us.
He burned incense to the idols.
So he kind of participates in some sort of religious ceremonies to others' idols, right? So that thing, that's another thing he does. What else? Verse 2 is filled with two different problems.
Didn't do what was right.
Idols, he made cast idols.
Yeah, so that's a violation of commandment. Not only did he do a graven image, but he also had other gods, because the Baals are other gods. They're the gods of that, the people of that area before the Israelites. So he's not only making graven images, but they're not even images of God. They're images of the other gods. And when it says he walks in the way of the kings of Israel, that kind of sounds like a good thing, but it's not, because he's a king of Judah. The kings of Israel are the unfaithful ones. The kings of Judah are the ones he should be walking in the ways of. So that's not a throwaway comment. That's actually a barb. So we have a whole host of problems with Ahaz right away here. And what seems to happen as a result?
It just gets worse for him. Interestingly, I read a couple of different versions of my own Bibles because I thought, why are we choosing to focus on Ahaz? There must be something I'm missing here. So I went to the King James to see how thou would have read about it back in the King James version. And it says, you know, as a preface, that Ahaz, reigning wickedly, is greatly afflicted by the Syrians. Sending for aid to Assyria, he is not helped thereby.
So we'll get to that, yeah.
We'll get to that, yeah.
So what does God do as a correction to Ahaz, you know, in this passage so far?
Handed him over to the king of Aram.
So the northern neighbors, the Syrians, God allows them to have victory over Ahaz, to in essence punish Ahaz for not being faithful. So this, according to the chronicler, that defeat is of God. That's what happens when you turn away from God. So the next portion, we'd like to read the finishing part of verse 5 through verse 15. Would somebody be willing to read that?
I'll do it.
Carol, thank you.
God, well, I'm reading from the Message. God, fed up, handed him over to the king of Aram, who beat him badly and took many prisoners into Damascus. God also let the king of Israel loose on him, and the result in a terrible slaughter. There was 120,000 killed that day, all of them first-class soldiers, and all because they had deserted God, the God of their ancestors. Furthermore, Zechari, I don't know how to say.
Yeah, Zikri, I would say.
Okay. The
Ephraim.
Okay. Hero killed the king's son,
Azrikam, the commander of the palace, and Elkanah, the next in authority to the king.
And that wasn't the end of it. The Israelites captured 20,000 men, women, and children, besides the huge cartloads of plunder they took to Samaria. And what's the end?
15. But there's less problematic words now.
Good. God's prophet Oded was in the neighborhood. He met the army when it entered Samaria and said, "Stop right there. You are, and listen. God, the God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah and used you to punish them. But you took things into your own hands, and under your anger, uncalled for and irrational, to turn your brothers and sisters from Judah and Jerusalem into slaves. Don't you see this is a terrible sin against your God? Careful now. Do exactly what I say. Return their captives, every last one of them. If you don't, you will find out how real anger, God's anger, works."
And Carol, I'm going to pause you there because now there's some tough names again. So I'll take over for the last few verses here.
Thank you.
Moreover, certain chiefs of the Ephraimites, Azariah son of Johanan, Berechiah son of Meshillamoth, Jehizkiah son of Shallum, and Amashah son of Hadlai stood up against those who were coming from the war and said to them, "You shall not bring the captives in here, for you propose to bring on us guilt against the Lord in addition to our present sins and guilt. Our guilt is already great. There is fierce wrath against Israel." So the warriors left the captives and booty before the officials and all the assembly. Then those who were mentioned by name got up and took the captives, and with the booty they clothed all that were naked among them. They clothed them, gave them sandals, provided them with food and drink, and anointed them. And carrying all the feeble among them on donkeys, they brought them to their kindred at Jericho, the city of palm trees. Then they returned to Samaria. So after defeat by Aram, a neighboring kingdom, which is modern-day Syria, what's the next military operation that's described here?
Plundering and prisoners.
Back and giving back the.
Well, before we get to what happens after the war, who is it that goes to war?
King of Israel.
Right. So again, in our modern day context, often we think of Israel as one place. These are two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. They've split. Under David and Solomon and Saul, they were together. They split now. So now they go to war. So first it was Syria, and now it's Syria's ally, Israel. Now they go to war against Judah. And unlike Syria, this is a civil war. These are the same people. We hear the word kindred a few times talking about these enemies within this passage. So what happens to Ahaz and Judah in their war with Israel?
Get whooped.
They get whooped. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They get absolutely routed, right? And we know that because the Bible says they took captive. Carol read 20,000. My Bible says 200,000
Mine too.
Mine too.
of their kin. So the Bible, in my translation anyway, when it says of their kin, which I think most have a similar translation, if not exact, it's saying that this war happened and then the captives they took were people they were related to, essentially. Maybe distantly, but they were the same people. This wasn't like they were taking a foreign power captive. So what is it that Oded, the prophet Oded, O-D-E-D, what is it the prophet objects to? Civil war, something else?
Well, he went out to meet the army that came to Samaria, and then he said to them, because the Lord, the God of your ancestors, is angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand, but you have killed them in a rage that has reached up to heaven. Ooh. Now you intend to subjugate the people of Judah, blah, 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 and then go on. And he basically, but what have you except sins against the Lord your God? So he reminds him that this is not quite the plan.
So the military defeat, the Lord gave Israel the victory over Judah. There's no problem with that. But now Oded comes a prophet in Israel, which usually the prophets are active in Judah now, not up in the northern kingdom of Israel. But here we have a prophet of the people that God is favoring right now, not the southern kingdom, but the northern kingdom, which is very, very unique in this situation because the northern kingdom has tended to be kind of no longer. They turn their back. God turns God's back on them. But now we have a faithful prophet, Oded. He says it's one thing to have won this battle.
Oh, good. How are you, Cindy?
Somebody's on a phone.
But they went a little too far. So what did they do? What happened? What did they do that was too far? What did they take too far?
Bringing back prisoners.
It's one thing to plunder the booty, to take all the valuables, but you brought back 200,000 captives of our kin. So what is Oded's reasoning here? Why is he saying that's problematic?
Because they were taking advantage of God's, they were, I don't know how to word.
We'll
Like
just say favor, Michelle?
Say it again.
Favor?
Yeah, this was God's business, that he was punishing Judah, and then the Israelites are like, oh, conveniently, now we have all these people and we'll enslave them, kind of without regard to the fact that it was God's doing in the first place. They became prideful about it.
And what's Oded's appeal? What is the appeal he makes to the people?
We're guilty too, so if you don't give them back, God's gonna show the same wrath on us. We're just as guilty. So unless you want to be the one being taken captive and killed,
So
maybe we should give them back.
This is why there's like this really interesting nugget here in 2 Chronicles chapter 28, because we've written the northern kingdom off as unfaithful people. And yet here Oded is saying, listen, we're followers of God too. They might not consider us that, but we think we are. And, you know, we've got our own problems with God. We're already guilty. God has offered us this favor and this victory.
So the army had come back to Samaria?
Samaria is the northern kingdom.
Okay. So is that interesting that, you know, we have the whole parable of the Good Samaritan and all, like, I just think that's an interesting connection. Like, here's Samaritans choosing to maybe do the right thing and give back.
You just made a great connection, Michelle. The idea that, oh, look, it's the unfaithful people being faithful.
Yeah.
King Ahaz is supposed to be the good, faithful king. He's unfaithful. The Jews are supposed to show consolation to their fellow Jew. They don't. The Samaritan does. So here it's a Samaritan prophet who shows that there's still faith in the northern kingdom and tells it, there's this great kind of thing like, yeah, we won this one, but if we do this, we're just as bad as they are. And you think God's going to keep favoring it? Like, we just got God's favor back. Could we just keep it for a moment here? The appeal's pretty strong to say we've got enough problems to deal with. We've got enough sin on our slate. Let's not add to it. But yeah, Michelle, great connection. He's a Samaritan. And these are the kind of reasons that by the New Testament time, Jews and Samaritans hate each other, because they've been warring with one another for centuries by that point, even though they were originally the same kin. So that's why they despised each other the worst, because it was their kin who turned on them. It wasn't the outside enemies. It was the people who were their own kin years before, centuries before. And those are the people that turn on one another. That's why Samaritan was a dirty word in Israel, the capital city and surrounding by the time of Jesus, right?
Chris,
And then there's go ahead. Somebody was going to say something.
I say, is this sort of like a civil war? Basically?
Absolutely, Dick. Yeah, absolutely, civil war. But one that, according to the chronicler, God's hand was all over. Because the southern kingdom would have been fine if they just were faithful, but Ahaz decides not to be. Mm-hmm. Ahaz decides not to follow. God wants Ahaz just to stand firm and not be involved in this military conflicts and things like that. And in other telling of this war, because this isn't the only place that these wars are happening in the Bible, they tell of it elsewhere. But in the other places, it's Ahaz being the aggressor, kind of, and fighting against Syria and Jerusalem together, not each of them in their own turn. So there's slight differences in how the story is told here. So we have other Samaritans who join the prophet Oded. We have some of maybe their military or political leaders saying, yeah, this is a bad idea. What Oded said is right. Like, let's just let's be glad with our victory, but let's not overdo it. And so then what do they do as a result? What happens as a result of this prophecy? Is it effective? Is Oded's prophecy effective?
Yeah, they turn the plunder back over to the prisoners and send the prisoners back home.
Right. Mm-hmm. Send them back to Samaria. Or no?
So, well, they end up back in Samaria. They take them back to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and then they return. So not only do they return to prisoners, but out of the plunder, they reclothe them, they care for them, they put the sick people on donkeys. So they probably continue to keep some of the plunder, but they use it to care for the people they've just captured in order to return them back to where they're from. Jericho, sorry, they take them to Jericho, not Jerusalem, right? So what a turn of events. You have 200,000 war prisoners. The prophet says, don't do that. They say, yeah, don't do that. That was a bad idea. We should return them. They do. That's pretty incredible. Prophecy doesn't usually work like that in the Bible. It's usually, great king, don't do this. And the king says, what do you know? But this time, the Samaritans are the faithful ones. The prophet tells his message and the Samaritans say, yeah, that's a good advice. We'll take that advice. We're going to turn back. We want to turn back into God's good graces. So a great example here of you can't paint with just one brush, right? And I've read one commentary say he read this story and he had been raised in a certain sect of Christianity that told him that other sects were not true Christians. And as he got older and became a theologian and a pastor in a different sect that had been pointed out as not true Christians by his childhood sect, he realized that, everybody has their unfaithfulness in different places, even the same believers, so he used it as in his own editorializing to say, this is a lesson to teach us that sometimes the unfaithful people are more faithful than we are. And I thought, yeah, that's a good lesson to learn. And that's definitely can be found here in the text. So I think that'll be probably a direction that we go on Sunday, a little bit anyway.
Chris?
Yes.
In this, while you're going through all this, I'm looking at the map because I want to see where this is actually taking place. And some of these places are 20, 40 miles apart, and knowing that they didn't, many of them were maybe with carts or, walk, but many walking. I don't think that they had, most mobility probably was walking. So here are these people who are dependent on leaders saying, go this way, go that way. No, you can't stay here. No, you have to go back now. I would be, and then Syria's way up north. And so I'm thinking, who's making these decisions? It's obviously people who needed better guidance or to hear the people out or something.
And you're right. It's not as simple as just turn around and go back. That takes a few days. But keep in mind that years before, these were people who came to worship at the temple in Jerusalem, because it exists at that time, from all over that area. So these people went to Jerusalem like 4 times a year by foot. So this wouldn't have been, like, you got to be kidding me. Like, yeah, these journeys were a couple days long for sure, but they were not unusual to the folks of this time, especially when you're talking about battles. Yeah, Egypt conquered huge swaths of area. Assyria conquers huge swaths of area that are way bigger. But then our story's not over, because the story of the Samaritan example here with Oded, that part comes to a conclusion. Oded uses prophecy to help the people turn away. But then we go back to King Ahaz. So let me read for you the conclusion of Ahaz's story here in Chronicles. At that time, King Ahaz sent to the king of Assyria for help, for the Edomites had again invaded and defeated Judah and carried away captives, and the Philistines had made raids in the cities of Shephelah and the Negeb of Judah, and had taken Beth Shemesh, Ajalon, Gederoth, Soko and its villages, with its villages, and Gimzo with its villages, and they settled there. For the Lord brought Judah low because of King Ahaz of Israel, for he had behaved without restraint in Judah and had been faithless to the Lord. So King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came against him and oppressed him instead of strengthening him. For Ahaz plundered the house of the Lord and the houses of the king and officials and gave tribute to the king of Assyria, but it did not help him. In the time of distress, he became yet more faithless to the Lord in the same King Ahaz. He sacrificed to the gods of Damascus, which had defeated him, and said, because the gods of the kings of Aram helped them, I'll sacrifice to them so they might help me. But they were the ruin of him and all of Israel. Ahaz gathered together utensils of the house of God and cut in pieces the utensils of the house of God. He shut up the doors of the house of the Lord and made himself altars in every corner of Jerusalem. In every city of Judah, he made high places to make offerings to other gods, provoking to anger the Lord, the God of his ancestors. Now the rest of his acts and all of his ways from first to last are written in the book of Kings of Judah and Israel. Ahaz slept with his ancestors, and they buried him in the city in Jerusalem, but they did not bring him into the tombs of the kings of Israel. His son Hezekiah succeeded him. How in general does Ahaz try to rectify his situation where he keeps facing military defeat? And what specifically does he do to achieve his goal?
He seems to keep turning further and further, further and further away from God, and turning more and more to the gods of the people who keep defeating him, thinking that will help bolster him and his people.
He does two things. He does something politically and something religiously. Religiously,
He shuts the doors of the house of the Lord. He closes them, which means a suspension of normal daily rituals in the temple, the very offerings.
Not only does he turn to the gods of the people who have defeated him, he literally shuts the door on worship to the God of Israel. So religiously, he not only starts to have other gods too, he does it at the exclusion of the Lord. So he makes altars everywhere in every place except for the temple. There's no more worship in the temple. He takes all the temple treasure and he takes all the temple decorations, and there's no more worship in the temple. He turns away from God completely. So what does he do politically?
He finally tries to make a deal with King of Assyria. Say, hey, I'll take you up on your offer.
So these two northern kings were trying to get Judah and Ahaz to ally with them to stand against Assyria. Ahaz says, no, I don't want to do that. So they punish Ahaz, basically. They take Judah. And then Ahaz turns to the very people they're trying to ally against for help. And how does that work out for him? How does he entice the king of Assyria to come and help? And what happens?
Kind of backfires on him. Verse 20 says he gave him trouble instead of help. The king of Assyria gave him trouble instead of help.
So Ahaz rounds up all the temple treasure, all the decorations of the temple that we're talking gold decorations, utensils. We're talking about silver and gold bowls, and everything is valuable. These aren't just decorations. Like, why did he give the king silverware? No, it's melted down precious metals. He pays the king of Assyria to come and be his protector. He says, hey, bully, will you come and be my bully for me? And the bully says, I'll be a bully, but not for you. So he pays the king of Assyria off. And instead of then protecting Judah, the king of Assyria says, you got any more money? And Ahaz, in effect, becomes a vassal state of Assyria. So when you ally yourself with a foreign empire, believe it or not, the foreign empire doesn't keep you on equal footing. They just control you. And that's why the whole idea of the chronicler and all of the historians who write in the Bible, they're saying, this is what happens. This is why God said not to ally yourself with all these foreign powers, because eventually you would get swallowed up by them, either by military defeat or by becoming a vassal, which is what King Ahaz does. He becomes a vassal to Assyria, and his protector ends up not protecting him, but actually weakening him and kind of taking over. So he seeks protection militarily from outside. He seeks protection from other gods religiously. Ahaz goes further and further away from God. And now you can understand why in the midst of all that, Isaiah tries to appeal to him and say, just sit tight. In just a couple of years, Assyria is going to be a thing of the past. Your northern neighbors, they're going to be a thing of the past. Just sit tight. Hold fast to the Lord. Ahaz does anything but. And so the chronicler, and we might miss it, but they mention one final indignity for Ahaz. Did you catch that in verse 27? What happened to him?
He didn't get buried where he should have been buried as a king. He got buried in Jerusalem, but not in the hall of the kings.
Which some of the kings of Jerusalem get very little biography in the Chronicles, but all of them, we're told basically where all of them are buried. That's important. Funeral rites are important. And so for Ahaz not to be buried with the other kings, that says something. So Ahaz sought, this is our last question, number 13. Ahaz sought military protection from others and favor from the gods of his enemies. What didn't he try that led to the way we remember him?
He didn't pray to God to help him and restore them, the country, the people.
And forgive him.
Yep.
He never humbled himself. He never sought God's protection, God's grace, none of that. He just kept going further and further down the road of what he thought was best for himself. And the chronicler doesn't talk about a lot of the prophets that come to King Ahaz. Oded was in the northern kingdom, not the southern kingdom where Ahaz is. But throughout the Bible, we have a lot of prophets who are talking to Ahaz, trying to get him to correct his ways. And he doesn't.
And he's young. I mean, during this period of time, he was 20 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 16 years.
He had a lot of time to
Have a lot of time to ruin a country. And we find Hezekiah is known as one of the best kings of Israel, his son. So Hezekiah reinstitutes a lot of the things that his father undid. So we see the course of history change under Hezekiah. That's why in Isaiah, when Isaiah talks about his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, King of Kings, we think that Isaiah is talking about the coronation names of Hezekiah, as well as predicting, we can see that as a prophecy of Jesus, but Isaiah is also just saying the person who follows you is going to be a lot better, Ahaz. We're gonna be better. God's gonna help restore us here with this next leader. So we have a lot going on in this chapter. There's a lot of the history of Israel under Ahaz that connects to so many things. But the key piece that we want to talk about today, is Oded, who he is, the prophet, and as Michelle related to us too. It's not insignificant that he's a Good Samaritan. So that's something to take away from Oded. Oded plays a good role here in helping people understand the boundaries a little bit. So as we conclude, some questions for reflection. If your life was written in one chapter, what do you think would be emphasized up till now? What do you hope to change before your chapter's finished? And what do you wish to see remain? So in Chronicles anyway, Ahaz gets one chapter. And this is what we know of Ahaz. So if your life was written hundreds of years after you're gone, what would you like to see your biography say? And what still needs to be changed before it's finished is my questions for reflection. So thanks everybody for Bible study's been very different over the past few months with Marcy and I, and it's been nice to still be able to meet every week, even if we've had to meet over Zoom. And we'll see how this all starts up again in September. We have some fun ideas, not just for Bible study, but for lots of things going on in the church. And we'll hope to see how they play out. But We really have appreciated the conversations each week. I know I have, and I can speak for Marcy in that too. And I hope that we'll all be able to join together again come September from wherever we may be. And we'll continue to try our best to, even as we go back in person, to make sure that there's a way that we can connect with those of you who can't be here every week, because that's important for us to do. So we're going to try our best to do that.
Been fun Zooming with everybody. Have a great summer, all.
Yes, all of you too.
So we'll hope to see all of you again sometime soon. In the meantime, take care.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
Bye.
bye.